Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of northern Alabama. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the shadow of the Appalachians, where the hills rise and fall like the breaths of sleeping giants, there once stood a mining town called Ravensbrook. Few remember its name now, erased from modern maps after what happened in the autumn of 1897. The official records claim the town was abandoned due to depleted coal reserves, but yellowed newspaper clippings and fragments of personal journals tell a far more disturbing tale. The town's origins trace back to 1890, though the area had long been known to local hunters and trappers as a place of unusual stillness. Native tribes avoided the northern hills of Walker County, referring to them in their oral histories as the place where shadows linger. Early settlers largely dismissed these warnings as superstition, focusing instead on the rich natural resources that lay both above and below the soil. The earliest documented European presence in the area dates to 1817, when surveyor Bartholomew Thorne noted in his field journal, "These northern hills, while abundant in timber and showing promising coal outcroppings, maintain an atmosphere most oppressive to the spirit. My guides refused to venture beyond the lower slopes after midday, claiming the upper reaches belong to something they will not name." Thorne's subsequent entries show increasing agitation, culminating in his abrupt departure from the region without completing his commissioned survey. For decades thereafter, the area remained largely untouched by industrial development, despite Alabama's growing reputation as a center for coal and iron production. Local farmers and hunters gave the hills a wide berth, speaking in hushed tones about livestock that wandered into the upper valleys and returned changed, more aggressive, prone to illness, or in some cases exhibiting unusual physical alterations such as discolored eyes or asymmetrical growth patterns. Ravensbrook materialized almost overnight in 1890 when the Excelsior Mining Company, under the direction of Montgomery Harrington, a Boston industrialist with connections to several northeastern banking establishments, discovered a rich vein of coal beneath the hills. Harrington, a stern-faced man with calculating eyes and a reputation for ruthless efficiency, saw in Alabama's untapped resources an opportunity that his competitors had overlooked. Initial surveys suggested the coal deposits in the area were modest, but drill samples taken in early 1890 revealed seams of remarkable quality extending far deeper than anticipated. Within weeks of these discoveries, Harrington had secured mineral rights to over 3,000 acres and dispatched construction crews to build what would become Ravensbrook. The company's chief geologist, Dr. Arthur Whitmore, expressed reservations about the site in his preliminary report, noting unusual mineral formations and what he described as anomalous temperature variations in the deepest test bores. The coal extracted from below the 500-foot level, he wrote, while superficially similar to standard bituminous deposits, exhibits subtle but measurable differences in carbon density and trace mineral content. Most curious is its resistance to normal degradation when exposed to air. Samples show virtually no oxidation, even after weeks of exposure. Whitmore recommended additional testing before proceeding with full-scale mining operations. His concerns were summarily dismissed by Harrington, who reportedly told his board of directors, "We are in the business of extraction, not academic curiosities." Whitmore resigned his position shortly thereafter, citing unspecified ethical disagreements with company policy. He disappeared from public record until 1904, when his name appears in the admission logs of the Tuscaloosa Asylum for the Insane, where he died 3 years later without ever regaining what doctors termed rational faculties. By summer 1890, over 200 souls had taken up residence in hastily constructed company housing. The town grew in the typical fashion of mining settlements, a main street cutting through the center, with the company store and offices standing prominently at one end, and rows of identical wooden houses stretching outward like ribs from a spine. The mine entrances, 3 in total, were positioned at the northern edge of the settlement, their dark mouths gaping into the hillside like wounds. The Excelsior Company promised prosperity and stability to all who would work their mines. The recruitment broadsides, distributed throughout Alabama and neighboring states, depicted smiling families, modern amenities, and wages higher than those offered by competing operations. "Find your future in Ravensbrück," they proclaimed, "where industry meets opportunity in Alabama's new model community." What they delivered instead was 12-hour shifts, dangerous conditions, and a system of debt peonage through the company store that kept most workers perpetually owing more than they earned. This practice, common throughout mining communities of the era, was particularly egregious at Ravensbrück, where prices for essential goods ran 30 to 40% higher than in neighboring towns. A ledger from the company store, preserved in the Alabama Industrial Archives, shows that a typical miner earning $250 for a 12-hour shift might pay $0.60 for a 5-pound sack of flour, $0.45 for a pound of coffee, and $0.75 for basic tools, all at markup rates exceeding 200% of wholesale cost. Medical treatment from the company doctor required payment in advance, typically amounting to 1 full day's wages for even minor consultations. Despite these harsh realities, Ravensbrück grew steadily during its first years. A small church was built on the eastern edge of town, though company policy required the minister to submit his sermons for approval before delivery. A schoolhouse followed, offering basic education to the miners' children, though classes were frequently interrupted when older boys were called to work as breaker boys, sorting coal and removing impurities from the raw ore. By 1893, the population had swelled to nearly 500, and Excelsior's quarterly reports to its shareholders boasted of ever-increasing production figures. "The Ravensbrück operation," read the spring 1893 report, "has exceeded all production projections by 17%, while maintaining operating costs below industry averages. The unusually high quality of coal extracted from our deepest workings commands premium prices from steel manufacturers and provides a significant competitive advantage." What these reports failed to mention were the mounting safety concerns expressed by workers and the growing number of injuries occurring in the deepest sections of Mine Number 3. The company's internal accident logs, later recovered during litigation, documented 27 serious injuries and 8 fatalities during the first 3 years of operation, a rate nearly double the industry average for the period. More telling were the types of incidents reported. While most mining accidents of the era resulted from roof collapses, gas explosions, or mechanical failures, an unusual number of Ravensbrück's incidents were classified as worker error due to disorientation or unexplained behavioral anomalies. Several reports described experienced miners becoming lost in tunnels they had worked for months, while others documented workers found standing motionless at their stations, unresponsive to external stimuli for periods ranging from several minutes to, in one extreme case, nearly 3 hours. A report from the Alabama Department of Labor, dated June 1895, notes concerning conditions at Mine Number 3, including inadequate ventilation, unstable support structures, and flooding in the lower levels. The inspector, one Tobias Williams, wrote, "The further one descends into this operation, the more evident it becomes that proper engineering principles have been abandoned in favor of rapid extraction. The support timbers in the lowest tunnels are insufficient for the weight they bear, and the air grows foul beyond safe limits within minutes of entry." Williams recommended immediate action, including the installation of additional ventilation shafts, reinforcement of all tunnel supports, and cessation of all work beyond the 200-foot depth until these improvements were completed. His report also contained a curious addendum, often overlooked by later researchers. Of particular concern are the unusual geological formations encountered in the western expansion. The coal seam there intersects with a stratum of unidentified black stone that appears to absorb light to an unusual degree. Workers report extreme discomfort when near these formations, describing sensations of pressure, auditory hallucinations, and, in several cases, temporary blindness. I strongly recommend that this section be sealed pending further geological assessment. Subsequent correspondence indicates that no substantive changes were implemented. Instead, Montgomery Harrington responded with a scathing letter to Williams's superiors, questioning the inspector's competence and suggesting that his report was motivated by personal animosity or, perhaps, financial inducement from competing mining interests. The matter was quietly dropped, and Excelsior continued operations without interruption. This corporate indifference to safety would prove significant in the events that unfolded 2 years later. Life in Ravensbrück settled into the rhythmic monotony typical of mining communities. Men descended into darkness each morning and emerged, coal-blackened and exhausted, 12 hours later. Women maintained homes under the constant assault of coal dust that penetrated every crack and crevice. Children played in the shadow of the ever-growing slag heap that rose like a monument to industry's triumph over nature. The town doctor, Silas Merritt, maintained detailed records of the community's health, documenting the inevitable mining injuries along with the slow-developing respiratory ailments that plagued even those who never entered the tunnels. His journal, recovered decades later from his abandoned office, reveals a man increasingly concerned about what he was observing. An entry from February 1896 reads, "I have now documented 17 cases of what I can only describe as premature aging, among workers assigned to the lower levels of mine number 3. Men in their 30s presenting with joint deterioration and cognitive impairment consistent with individuals twice their age. Most troubling is that these symptoms appear unrelated to the typical coal worker's pneumoconiosis that one expects in this population. Something else is at work here." A later entry elaborates. Patient WH, age 34, employed as a driller in the western section for 14 months, now exhibits muscle atrophy, severe joint degradation, and intermittent aphasia. Physical symptoms might be attributed to the demanding nature of his work, but the cognitive decline is more puzzling. When questioned about his work, he becomes agitated and repeats the phrase, "They're listening through the walls." Most disturbing is the presence of unusual dermal lesions along his spine, perfectly circular, approximately 1 centimeter in diameter, with a pronounced indentation at the center. I have now observed similar markings on 6 patients, all working in the same section of mine number 3. Dr. Poe. Merritt's attempts to discuss these observations with company management were repeatedly rebuffed. His journal indicates he began collecting samples, blood, tissue, even coal dust from affected workers' lungs, hoping to identify the cause of these anomalies. The samples, if they ever existed, were never found. It was on September 17, 1897, according to Merritt's records, that the first unusual occurrences were noted. His journal describes how several miners reported hearing strange reverberations deep within the main shaft of mine number 3. The sounds were described variously as like distant machinery, similar to whispers in a large, empty room, and most disturbingly, akin to the buzzing of insects, but with an almost deliberate rhythm, as though communicating. One miner, Franklin Dowd, described his experience to Dr. Merritt during treatment for an unrelated hand injury. "It started like a hum, Doc, way back in the new western tunnels. Me and the others thought maybe it was just air moving through some crack we couldn't see, but then it changed, started making patterns like 3 short, 2 long, pause, then repeat, over and over." Jenkins said it reminded him of Morse code, though none of us knows that stuff well enough to say what it might have been saying. The foreman told us to ignore it, but you can't unhear something like that once it gets in your head. These reports were initially dismissed as the normal settling of Earth or the psychological effects of extended periods in the dimly lit tunnels, yet the accounts persisted and increased in frequency over the following weeks. By early October, the phenomena had escalated. The mine foreman, Zachariah Pruitt, a veteran of 20 years in various coal operations throughout the region, documented increasing instances of unexplained equipment failures. Tools would be found broken or missing despite being properly stored at the end of shifts. Lanterns would extinguish simultaneously in certain tunnel sections, leaving workers in absolute darkness until they could be relit. Most troubling were the numerous reports of miners feeling as though they were being observed by unseen presences in the darkened recesses of the deepest tunnels. Pruitt, not a man given to superstition or idle speculation, noted in his daily report of October 7th. The men speak increasingly of eyes watching from beyond the reach of their lamps. I would dismiss such talk as the natural anxiety of working beneath thousands of tons of earth had I not experienced the sensation myself yesterday while inspecting the new western expansion. There is something deeply unsettling about that section of the mine that I cannot articulate. A page from his personal notebook, later discovered among his effects, contains a rough map of the western tunnels with several areas marked with an X and the notation, "Sound strongest here. Walls warm to touch despite depth." Jenkins claims to have seen something moving just beyond lamplight, refused to return to section. 3 men have now reported same phenomena, must speak with Stillwell about possibly sealing this section pending further investigation. The Birmingham News on October 12, 1897, ran a small article mentioning growing unrest among the workforce at Ravensbrook, noting that production had fallen by nearly 30% in the preceding weeks. A local spiritualist publication, The Ethereal Messenger, took a different approach, publishing an anonymous letter, purportedly from a Ravensbrook resident, claiming that entities from the deeper earth have been disturbed by the mining operations and now seek communion with the surface world. The letter described messages transmitted through solid stone and visitations during the deepest hours of night. While easily dismissed as sensationalism typical of such publications, certain details in the account align disturbingly well with the more sober documentation found in Merritt's and Pruitt's records. The article attributed the decline to possible labor agitation and unverified reports of unsafe conditions, making no mention of the more unusual occurrences now being widely discussed among the miners. Montgomery Harrington, alarmed by the production shortfall rather than the welfare concerns, dispatched his operations manager, Victor Stillwell, to investigate and restore order. Stillwell, a methodical man with a military background and little patience for what he termed the superstitious tendencies of the laboring class, arrived in Ravensbrook on October 14th. His initial report back to Harrington, sent via telegram the same day, stated simply, "Arrived Ravensbrook, stop production issues result of poor discipline and possible organized disruption. Stop will resolve promptly. Stop rumors of unusual phenomena wholly without merit stop." Stillwell's arrival coincided with the first disappearance. On October 15, 1897, shift supervisor Harrison Blackwood failed to return home after his night shift. His wife, Evelyn, reported his absence to Foreman Pruitt early the following morning. A search party formed by his colleagues found only his lunch pail and pickaxe at his assigned work area in the eastern section of Mine Number 3. The tunnel showed no signs of collapse, flooding, or any other obvious hazard that might explain his absence. The mine was thoroughly searched over the next 2 days, with no trace of Blackwood discovered. Company records subsequently listed him as terminated due to abandonment of post, suggesting he had simply walked away from his job, a not uncommon occurrence in mining operations of the period, where workers sometimes left without notice when conditions became intolerable. This explanation might have been accepted had it not been for 2 more disappearances in the next week. On October 18th, brothers Vincent and Oliver Whitaker, who worked as drillers preparing blast holes for the following day's explosives, vanished during their shift. Like Blackwood, they left behind their tools and personal items with no indication of what had befallen them. A letter from Evelyn Blackwood to her sister in Mobile, dated October 20th, casts doubt on the company's explanation for her husband's disappearance. Harrison would never abandon us, especially with winter approaching and little Thomas still recovering from his fever. He spoke of strange happenings in the mine these past weeks, sounds no one could explain, tools moved from where they were left, and an oppressive feeling that grew worse as they dug deeper. The night before he vanished, he showed me an odd mark on his arm, a perfect circle that he said burned to the touch, though it looked like nothing more than a bruise. I fear something terrible has happened that the company wishes to conceal. By October 24th, 5 miners had vanished without explanation, each last seen entering mine number 3 for their shifts. The atmosphere in Ravensbrück had transformed from unease to undisguised fear. Attendance at the daily shifts fell dramatically as workers either claimed illness or simply failed to report. The Excelsior Company attempted to quell the rising panic by bringing in additional security personnel from Birmingham and offering a substantial reward for information leading to an explanation of the disappearances. A notice posted at the company office on October the 25th read, $500 reward for information leading to the apprehension of persons responsible for recent disruptions to mining operations and the whereabouts of workers who have abandoned their positions. All information will be held in strictest confidence. These efforts proved ineffective as workers began abandoning the town entirely, forfeiting their wages, rather than continuing to enter the mine. Company ledgers show that by October 30th, workforce attendance had dropped to less than 40% of normal levels. During this period, Dr. Merritt's journal entries become increasingly disturbed. On October 23rd, he wrote, "I was summoned to the home of Mrs. Pruitt shortly after midnight. She reported that her husband had awakened screaming and could not be calmed. Upon my arrival, I found him seated at the kitchen table, staring fixedly at his hands. He spoke little, but repeated one phrase several times. They're in the walls now. I administered a sedative and will check on him in the morning." The following day, Merritt reported that Pruitt had no recollection of the incident and insisted on returning to work, dismissing his nocturnal episode as nothing more than a nightmare. However, within the week, 3 more households reported similar incidents. Individuals awakening in extreme distress, often speaking of something coming through the walls or voices in the earth. One particularly detailed account comes from the journal of Rebecca Simmons, wife of miner Thomas Simmons. Thomas woke just past 3 again, covered in sweat despite the chill. His eyes were open, but he didn't seem to see me. He walked to the window and pressed his ear against the glass, then to the floor, listening. When I asked what he heard, he said, "They're using our voices to learn how to speak." He didn't remember any of it come morning. This is the 3rd night this week. Something is happening to the men who work the deep western tunnels. They're changing. Stillwell's reports back to Montgomery Harrington during this period, preserved in company archives, make no mention of these psychological disturbances, focusing instead on his efforts to maintain production levels with a diminishing workforce. He attributes the disappearances to labor agitators, possibly working in concert with competing mining interests to undermine Excelsior's operations. However, a personal letter from Stillwell to his wife in Boston, intercepted by company security and never delivered, now preserved in the Alabama Corporate Archives, reveals a different perspective. The situation here is more troubling than I initially assessed. While I maintain an optimistic front in my official communications, I must confess to you my growing concern. There is something deeply amiss in this operation that I cannot yet identify. The miners speak of sounds and sensations within the deeper tunnels that defy rational explanation, and I have myself experienced moments of profound disorientation when inspecting these areas. More concerning are the disappearances, which show patterns inconsistent with typical labor disputes or desertions. I have discreetly initiated a more thorough investigation of the western tunnels, where the most unusual reports originate. I tell you this in strictest confidence, as I would not wish to create alarm. What transformed the situation from concerning to horrifying was the discovery made on the morning of November 2nd, 1897. A maintenance worker checking a rarely used ventilation shaft on the western edge of the mining complex found a miner's boot. Inside the boot was a severed human foot. Dr. Merritt's journal provides the most detailed account of what followed. The foot belonged to a male adult and had been severed with what he described as surgical precision. More disturbing was his observation that the tissue showed no signs of decomposition despite the estimated week since the individual had disappeared. Merritt wrote, "I have examined numerous limbs traumatically severed in mining accidents. These typically show crushing damage, tearing of tissue, and splintering of bone. The specimen before me bears none of these characteristics. The cut is clean, as though performed with an exceptionally sharp instrument by someone with anatomical knowledge. Moreover, despite the time elapsed since the disappearances began, there is a peculiar freshness to the tissue that defies explanation." He continued in a later entry, "Microscopic examination reveals cellular structures unlike anything in my experience. The cells appear to be in a state of suspended animation rather than necrosis, and there are unusual filamentary structures connecting tissues that should have no such connections. Most disturbing is the presence of minute black particles throughout the tissue, not coal dust as one might expect, but perfectly spherical bodies of unknown composition that appear to be embedded within the cells themselves." The discovery prompted a more thorough investigation of the mine's peripheral tunnels and shafts. According to the Walker County Sheriff's report dated November 3, 1897, 3 more body parts were recovered from various locations within the mine complex. A hand, a partial forearm, and, most disturbingly, a segment of what appeared to be a human spine. All showed the same precision in their severance and the same uncanny preservation. Sheriff Nathaniel Cooper's official report concludes, "The recovered remains suggest foul play of a most disturbing nature. The precision of the dismemberment indicates an individual with specialized knowledge, possibly medical training. We have questioned all residents with such background, including Dr. Merritt, and have found no cause for suspicion. The investigation continues." What happened next remains a matter of historical debate and is where the historical record becomes increasingly difficult to reconcile. The official report indicates that a thorough search of the mine was conducted by the Sheriff's Department with assistance from company security personnel, with no further evidence recovered. Operations were temporarily suspended pending completion of the investigation. However, personal accounts from townspeople suggest a far different sequence of events. A letter from Margaret Pruitt, wife of Foreman Zachariah, to her sister in Tuscaloosa, dated November 8, 1897, describes how the men who entered Mine Number 3 for the investigation emerged changed, speaking little and avoiding eye contact with their fellows. She notes that her husband, previously loquacious and good-humored, had become withdrawn and refused to discuss what they had found. "Zachariah sits for hours staring at nothing," she wrote. "When I press him about what happened in that dreadful place, he only shakes his head and whispers that some things should stay buried. I fear for his sanity, and indeed for all of us who remain in this cursed town." She continues with a particularly disturbing observation. "Last night, I awoke to find his side of the bed empty. I located him in our son's room, standing over the boy's bed, simply watching him sleep. When I asked what he was doing, he turned to me with an expression I did not recognize, as though someone else were looking through his eyes. He said nothing, but returned to bed. This morning he had no recollection of the incident." A similar account comes from the Journal of Eleanor Whitaker, mother of the missing brothers, who wrote on November 10th, "Mr. Stillwell visited today, offering condolences and the company's assurance that everything possible is being done to locate Vincent and Oliver. But there was something in his manner, a tension, an unwillingness to meet my gaze, that belied his words. He knows more than he is saying. They all do. Her entry the following day is more alarming. I observed Mr. Stillwell and Dr. Merritt in heated discussion behind the company office this afternoon. Though I could not hear their words, their gestures suggested significant disagreement. As I passed, they fell silent and regarded me with what I can only describe as suspicion, bordering on hostility. Later, I noticed a man I did not recognize watching my house from across the street, a tall, gaunt individual in formal attire not suited to our town. When I opened my door to confront him, he walked away without acknowledgement. I am increasingly convinced that my son's disappearance is connected to something the company wishes to conceal. The most significant document from this period comes from Victor Stillwell himself. His report to Montgomery Harrington, marked confidential, and only made public during a 1952 review of company records, contains the following passage. The conditions discovered in the lower western tunnels defy rational explanation. The chambers we located were certainly not part of any approved mining operation. Their purpose and origins remain unknown. I cannot in good conscience recommend continuing operations at this location. Furthermore, I strongly advise against allowing knowledge of our discoveries to spread beyond those already aware. The potential for widespread panic would be considerable. The report includes no specific details about what was discovered, but concludes with a recommendation to permanently seal mine number 3 and relocate operations to their holdings in the Cahaba field to the south. What was in those chambers that so disturbed a man of Stillwell's temperament? The report offers no clarity, and subsequent interviews with surviving members of the investigation team, conducted decades later, yielded contradictory accounts. Some claim to have seen nothing unusual beyond evidence of unauthorized tunneling. Others refused to discuss the matter at all, even into their final years. One account from a former Excelsior security guard named Samuel Davidson, recorded in 1952 when he was in his 80s, provides perhaps the most detailed, if difficult to credit, description. What we found wasn't mining work. The walls were too smooth, like they'd been polished, and there were markings, not writing exactly, more like symbols carved into the stone. They seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. The worst part was the pit in the central chamber. It was perfectly circular, maybe 30 feet across, and so deep our lamps couldn't illuminate the bottom. There was a sound coming from it, a low vibration that you felt more than heard. Several men became violently ill just being near it. That's when Stillwell ordered us out and said the mine was to be sealed immediately. Davidson's account becomes more disturbing as he continues. Before we left, Jenkins, one of the deputies, thought he saw movement along the chamber wall. He approached to investigate and suddenly screamed. When we reached him, he was pressed against the rock face, or rather partly into it, as though the stone had become fluid and was drawing him in. We tried to pull him free, but the force holding him was too strong. The last thing I saw before Stillwell ordered us to run was Jenkins' face as it sank into the rock, still conscious, still screaming, though no sound came out. That wall swallowed him whole, and the surface sealed smooth behind him, as though he'd never been there. When pressed on why this incident didn't appear in any official reports, Davidson became agitated. Stillwell made us swear an oath, said it was a matter of national security, that Washington had been notified and would handle the situation. He told us anyone who spoke about what we'd seen would be charged with treason. But that's not why we kept quiet. We kept quiet because we knew no one would believe us, and because we were afraid that talking about it might somehow bring that thing's attention to us. Davidson's account, dismissed by historians as the embellished recollections of an elderly man, remains the only detailed description of what might have been discovered in the lower tunnels. Whether accurate or not, what we know with certainty is that on November 15, 1897, the Excelsior Mining Company announced the immediate closure of all Ravensbrück operations. The company's public statement cited geological instability and flooding concerns as the reason for abandonment, making no mention of the disappearances or recovered remains. Workers were given 3 days to vacate company housing with minimal severance and no assistance in relocating. Many left with little more than they could carry, abandoning furniture and personal possessions in their haste to distance themselves from Ravensbrück. A report in the Birmingham Industrial Gazette, dated November 17th, noted, "The sudden closure of the Ravensbrück operation has released nearly 300 miners into an already saturated labor market. Many arrived in Birmingham yesterday with harrowing tales of unsafe conditions and unexplained disappearances." Company representatives deny these allegations, attributing the closure to economic factors and declining coal quality in the deeper seams. By month's end, the town had been largely abandoned, with only a few holdouts remaining, primarily elderly residents unable to relocate, and a handful of families with nowhere else to go. The company store closed, followed by the school and church. Mine entrances were barricaded with heavy timbers and warning signs posted. An unusual addendum to the closure appears in Excelsior's internal records. A telegram from Montgomery Harrington to Victor Stilwell, dated November 20th, reads, "Arrangements finalized with Interior Department Stop Special Team arriving November 25th. Stop ensure all remaining personnel evacuated from Western Quadrant. Stop no documentation to be retained. Stop." The referenced special team does not appear in any other company records, nor in any accessible government archives. The mystery might have ended there, dismissed as nothing more than a failed mining venture, had it not been for what happened in December of that year. A hunting party from the neighboring town of Oakman, tracking deer through the hills near the abandoned Ravensbrück, reported hearing mechanical sounds emanating from the sealed entrance of mine number 3. When they approached to investigate, they observed several men in formal attire entering the sealed mine through what appeared to be a recently constructed secondary entrance. The hunters, led by experienced woodsman Jedediah Tanner, reported their observations to the Walker County Sheriff, who dispatched 2 deputies to investigate. According to the official report, the deputies found no evidence of activity at the mine and declared the hunters' claims to be without merit. However, one of the deputies, Jeremiah Coleman, resigned his position the following day and left the county without explanation. When located by researchers in 1960, living in Arizona under a different name, Coleman refused all discussion of Ravensbrück, saying only that he had seen enough of what lies beneath those hills to last several lifetimes. Tanner, however, maintained the accuracy of his account until his death in 1943. In a statement given to local historian Edwin Mosley in 1935, he elaborated on what his party had witnessed. "We heard it plain as day, a mechanical, whirring and grinding, like some great machine working deep underground. When we approached the main entrance, we found it still sealed as the company had left it, but there was a new opening about 50 yards to the west, looked professionally constructed with timber supports and a metal door. While we watched from the tree line, a carriage arrived, expensive looking, with blacked-out windows. 3 men emerged, all in dark suits and carrying leather cases. They unlocked the metal door and entered the mine. About an hour later they came out with their cases, which now appeared heavy enough to require effort to carry. They loaded these into the carriage and departed. What struck me most was their appearance. Despite emerging from a coal mine, their suits remained immaculate, not a speck of dust on them. And their movements were odd, too precise, like they were performing a rehearsed sequence. Not one of them spoke a word that we could hear, communicating only through nods and gestures. The most disturbing evidence from this period comes from the Journal of Abigail Lancaster, one of the few remaining residents of Ravensbrück. Her entry from December 21st, 1897 reads, "They come at night now, arriving in black carriages with the lamps extinguished. They think no one observes them, but I have counted 12 different men over the past week, all well-dressed and speaking with northern accents. They bring large trunks into the mine and emerge hours later with these same containers, now requiring 2 men to carry each. Whatever they are removing from beneath our feet must be of considerable value. Her subsequent entry, dated December 23rd, describes an unsettling encounter. I was gathering firewood near the edge of town when one of the strangers approached me. He was tall, unnaturally pale, with eyes that seemed too dark for his face. He asked how many people still resided in Ravensbrück. When I told him perhaps a dozen, he smiled in a way that brought no warmth to his features and said, "Soon there will be none." He offered me money to leave immediately, more than enough to establish myself elsewhere. I plan to depart tomorrow after collecting the last of my possessions. Her journal contains one final entry, dated December 24th. I heard something moving on my roof last night, like footsteps, but too numerous and too light for a man. When I looked outside, I saw nothing, but the fresh snowfall showed strange markings, not footprints as I know them, but circular impressions arranged in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. I have decided to leave without delay, abandoning most of my belongings. As I write this, I can hear something scratching at the walls. I will not spend another night in this place. Her journal ends abruptly after this entry. County records indicate that Lancaster's home was found abandoned in January 1898, with no trace of her whereabouts ever determined. A search of the premises revealed signs of hasty departure, with meals left half-eaten on the table and clothing still hanging on lines to dry. By spring of 1898, Ravensbrück had been completely deserted. The Excelsior Mining Company sold its Alabama holdings to various local interests later that year and ceased operations entirely by 1900. Montgomery Harrington retired to a sizable estate in Massachusetts, where he died of natural causes in 1912, having never publicly addressed the events at Ravensbrück. Curiously, Harrington's personal papers, willed to Harvard University's business archives, contain no mention of the Ravensbrück operation despite extensive documentation of his other business ventures. One notation in his private diary, dated December 30th, 1897, reads simply, "Alabama matter concluded, V.S. Transferred to special assignment with Interior Department. Financial loss considerable, but necessary. Some costs cannot be measured in dollars." Victor Stilwell's subsequent career is more difficult to trace. Company records indicate he left Excelsior's employment in January 1898. A man of the same name appears in the employment records of the Department of War in 1899, assigned to an unspecified Special Research Division. No further documentation of his activities or eventual fate has been located. The abandoned town gradually succumbed to nature and time. Buildings collapsed under the weight of winter snow or were dismantled by locals salvaging materials. The forest reclaimed cleared areas, and within a decade little remained to indicate that hundreds had once lived and worked there. Local legends began to emerge about the abandoned mining site. Hunters and trappers reported unusual phenomena in the vicinity, compasses that failed to function properly, unexplained lights seen at night, and animals that avoided the area entirely. More disturbing were accounts of people who ventured too close to the old mine entrances and experienced lost time, returning to their homes with no memory of hours or even days. The site remained largely untouched until 1957, when a geological survey team from the University of Alabama sought to assess the area's potential for renewed mining operations. Their preliminary examination of the sealed Mine No. 3 entrance was cut short when 2 team members were hospitalized with severe respiratory ailments after briefly exploring the outermost tunnel. The team leader, Dr. Howard Mitchell, noted in his report that the tunnel walls showed evidence of unusual structural modifications inconsistent with standard mining practices of the period. He also observed that their equipment experienced unexplained malfunctions within 50 yards of the entrance, with compasses spinning erratically and battery-powered devices failing despite being fully charged. Most intriguing was Mitchell's documentation of what he termed anomalous growth patterns in the vegetation surrounding the mine entrance. Plants nearest the opening exhibited accelerated growth, but abnormal characteristics. Leaves with altered vein structures, woody stems with unusual density, and root systems that appeared to deliberately avoid penetrating more than a few inches into the soil. Mitchell's field notes, preserved in university archives, contain a passage not included in his official report. Richards collected several plant specimens from within 20 yards of the mine entrance. Under microscopic examination, these samples show cellular abnormalities unlike anything in the botanical literature. Most notable are the minute black particulates present throughout the tissue, perfectly spherical bodies approximately 5 microns in diameter that appear integrated with the cellular structures. The similarity to Dr. Merritt's observations from 1897, which I had previously dismissed as medical misinterpretation, is now impossible to ignore. The survey was abandoned, and Mitchell's recommendation that the site be permanently restricted from development was adopted by state authorities. No further exploration was attempted. In 1964, a highway construction project necessitated limited excavation near the former town site. Workers uncovered a mass grave containing the partial remains of at least 17 individuals. The remains showed evidence of precise dismemberment, similar to that described in the 1897 reports. More disturbing was the medical examiner's conclusion that the tissue showed remarkably little decomposition despite the presumed 67 years of interment. Dr. Malcolm Rivera, the forensic pathologist who examined the remains, wrote in his report, "The tissue exhibits a level of preservation that I would expect in remains no more than 1 year old. There is no evidence of embalming or other artificial preservation methods. Moreover, the cellular structure shows peculiar alterations at the microscopic level that I cannot attribute to any known pathogen or chemical agent. I have requested additional analysis from the CDC, but in the interim, recommend extreme caution in handling these remains." A confidential addendum to the report, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request in 2010, contained additional observations. Electron microscopy reveals the presence of artificial structures within the cellular matrix, microscopic constructs of unknown composition and purpose that appear to have integrated with the biological tissue. These structures exhibit geometrical precision inconsistent with known biological processes and remain functional despite the time elapsed since death. Most disturbing is their apparent response to electrical stimulation, suggesting some form of continued metabolic activity. I cannot overstate the potential significance of these findings or the importance of containing this material. The CDC's response, if it ever came, is not included in the publicly available documentation. The discovery prompted a brief investigation by state authorities, but with no living witnesses and no clear evidence of who was responsible, the case was eventually closed. The remains were reinterred in an unmarked grave in the Birmingham Memorial Cemetery, and the highway route was modified to avoid further disturbance of the area. Local interest in the Ravensbrook mystery resurged briefly in the late 1960s when several hikers reported seeing lights moving within the heavily overgrown area of the former town. These sightings coincided with unusual weather patterns, localized temperature drops, unusual fog formations, and in one case what witnesses described as ash-like particles falling from a clear sky. The most recent chapter in the Ravensbrook mystery occurred in 1969, when historian Claudia Thornton attempted to compile a comprehensive account of the events for her doctoral dissertation. After 6 months of research and multiple visits to the abandoned site, Thornton abruptly withdrew from her program, destroyed her notes, and refused all further discussion of the project. When pressed by colleagues, she would only say that some histories are best left unexamined. One associate who spoke on condition of anonymity claimed that Thornton had confided experiencing unusual phenomena during her final visit to the site, including periods of missing time and finding unfamiliar photographs among those she had taken, images she had no recollection of capturing. The associate elaborated. She showed me one photograph that particularly disturbed her. It appeared to show a tunnel wall with what looked like a face pressing through from the other side, the features distorted, as though the rock were a semi-fluid membrane. When I suggested it was probably just an unusual mineral formation, she became agitated and insisted that the face had not been visible when she took the picture. She burned the photograph along with her notes that same day. In the decades since, the Ravensbrück incident has been largely forgotten outside specialized historical circles and the occasional mention in compilations of regional mysteries. The land where the town once stood has been incorporated into a state forest preserve, with no markers or commemorative plaques to indicate its troubled history. Occasional reports still emerge from hikers or hunters who venture into the area, unusual sounds emanating from the ground, electronic equipment failing without explanation, and, most commonly, the sensation of being watched by unseen observers. Park rangers dismiss these accounts as the product of overactive imaginations influenced by the area's reputation, though some admit to avoiding certain sections of the preserve, particularly after dark. In 2001, a small group of amateur paranormal investigators attempted to locate and explore the sealed entrances to mine number 3. Their equipment reportedly malfunctioned as they approached the approximate location, and the group's leader later claimed they had experienced a 4-hour period of missing time, with no memory of what occurred after they reached a certain point in the forest. The other members of the team declined all requests for interviews, and the group disbanded shortly thereafter. What truly happened at Ravensbrück in the autumn of 1897? The official explanation that a mining accident led to several deaths that the company sought to cover up fails to account for numerous inconsistencies in the historical record. Why were the recovered remains surgically dismembered rather than showing evidence of a mine collapse or explosion? What was in the western tunnels that so disturbed Victor Stilwell and the investigation team? Who were the well-dressed men observed entering the abandoned mine weeks after its official closure, and what were they removing in those heavy trunks? Perhaps most disturbing is the question of why every official investigation of the site over the past century has been abruptly abandoned, often with investigators exhibiting unexplained physical or psychological symptoms following their exposure to the area. Some researchers have suggested that the mine might have penetrated natural gas pockets containing unusual compounds, causing hallucinations and paranoia among workers. Others propose that the entire incident was fabricated by labor organizers to discourage workers from crossing picket lines during an unrecorded strike. A more controversial theory advanced by geologist Dr. Eleanor Kinsella in a 1998 paper suggests that the mining operation might have uncovered an unknown mineral with unusual properties, perhaps radioactive or containing compounds toxic to humans in ways not understood at the time. The descriptions of tissue preservation, cellular abnormalities, and the reported psychological effects, she writes, are consistent with exposure to a powerful mutagen or cellular preservative unknown to contemporary science. That the government might have subsequently secured and classified such a discovery is entirely plausible, given its potential military applications. Kinsella's theory gained little traction among mainstream scientists, and her paper was ultimately rejected for publication in peer-reviewed journals. She continued her research independently until 2003, when she disappeared during a solo research expedition to the Ravensbrück area. Her abandoned vehicle was discovered at a trailhead, but despite an extensive search, no trace of Kinsella herself was ever found. More fringe theories have emerged in recent decades, ranging from the discovery of a previously unknown indigenous civilization's artifacts to suggestions of more otherworldly encounters. These speculations, while entertaining, find little support in the fragmentary historical record. What can be stated with certainty is that, between September and December 1897, at least 22 individuals disappeared in or around Ravensbrück. Only partial remains of some were ever recovered. The town was abandoned with unusual haste, and the mining company that created it dissolved shortly thereafter, its principals either relocating far from Alabama or vanishing from historical records entirely. The hills of northern Alabama hold many secrets. Some, like the rich coal seams that brought prosperity to the region, have been extracted and exhausted. Others, like whatever waits in the sealed chambers of Mine Number 3, remain untouched, protected by officially sanctioned silence and the natural human tendency to look away from things too disturbing to contemplate. The land where Ravensbrook once stood has long since been reclaimed by forest. No buildings remain, and no markers commemorate the lives lost there. Only distorted local legends persist, warning children to avoid the hungry hills where people once vanished without a trace. Occasionally, hikers or hunters in the area report unusual experiences, watches that stop at precisely 3:17, no matter their previous setting, compasses that point toward the old mine site rather than north, the sensation of being observed by unseen presences, or most commonly, dreams of descending endless staircases into chambers where shadows move independently of any light source. Park rangers dismiss these accounts as the product of overactive imaginations influenced by campfire tales. They note that the region's unusual geological formations can create acoustic anomalies and visual illusions, particularly during dawn and dusk hours when light angles through the dense forest canopy in unpredictable ways. One ranger, who requested anonymity, offered a different perspective. "I've worked these woods for 27 years, and there's a section about 3 miles in from the Eastern Trail that I won't enter alone. Nothing dramatic happened, no ghosts or monsters, but the feeling that comes over you there isn't natural, like something is evaluating you, deciding whether you're worth the effort. Animals feel it too. You'll never find so much as a squirrel in that area, no matter the season." Whatever happened in those hills 100 years ago left a mark that hasn't faded. In 1968, an elderly man claiming to be the son of one of the last families to leave Ravensbrook approached the Birmingham Historical Society with a sealed metal box he said had belonged to his father. The man, who identified himself as Joseph Pruitt, explained that his father had forbidden the box to be opened during his lifetime, but had instructed that it should be preserved for historical purposes after his death. Society records indicate that the box contained a single item, a pocket watch with the inscription 2ZP, for 10 years of loyal service, Excelsior Mining Co. The watch, presumably belonging to Foreman Zachariah Pruitt, was stopped at 3:17, and the inside of the case bore a crude inscription scratched into the metal: "They are not gone, they are beneath." Archivist Margaret Holden's notes on the acquisition include an odd addendum. "Mr. Pruitt became agitated when I attempted to wind the watch, snatching it from my hands with surprising strength for a man of his years. He insisted that it should never be wound, that doing so would be an invitation. When I pressed him to explain, he would say only that his father had made him swear on his deathbed never to restore the watch's movement, and that I must ensure the society maintained the same precaution." The watch was placed in the Historical Society's archives, where it remained until a small fire damaged that section of the collection in 1975. When the archives were reorganized following the fire, the watch was not found among the recovered items. Inquiries to Joseph Pruitt's last known address received no response, and subsequent efforts to locate him proved unsuccessful. In 2002, during routine maintenance of the Birmingham Memorial Cemetery, workers discovered that the unmarked grave containing the Ravensbrook remains had been disturbed. Despite no visible signs of excavation, ground-penetrating radar indicated that the burial vault was empty. No investigation was conducted, and the incident was attributed to administrative error, a conclusion that satisfied no one familiar with the case, but was nonetheless accepted in official records. The most recent connection to the Ravensbrook mystery emerged in 2017. when a construction project near the former town site unearthed a sealed mason jar containing a handwritten journal. The journal, attributed to Dr. Silas Merritt and dated October-November 1897, contained entries not found in his previously discovered medical records. The final entry, dated November 14th, reads, "I have analyzed the samples taken from the chamber walls. The material appears organic in nature, but exhibits no cellular structure consistent with any known living organism. Most disturbing is its response to electrical stimulation, contraction, followed by what can only be described as attempted reformulation around the stimulus source. Whatever we have uncovered in those depths, it is not inert mineral as Stilwell claims. It responds, it adapts, and I fear, based on what we have witnessed in the affected miners, it influences. God help us if it escapes the confines of the mine." The journal continues with a passage that has been the subject of considerable debate among the few researchers who have examined it. "My examination of Blackwood's recovered tissue confirms my worst suspicions. The black particulates are not merely present in the cells. They have restructured them from within, creating a hybrid organism that is neither fully human nor fully something else. Under sufficient magnification, these particles reveal geometric structures impossible in nature, perfect hexagonal arrays with what appear to be microscopic mechanical components. I can draw only one conclusion, however fantastic it may seem. We have discovered evidence of a technology far beyond our current understanding, and it has been buried beneath these hills for God knows how long." The journal's authenticity has been questioned by historians who note inconsistencies in handwriting and terminology compared to Merritt's confirmed writings. Nevertheless, soil analysis of the jar and paper dating suggested the artifact had indeed been buried for approximately 120 years. The journal was submitted to the Alabama Department of Archives and History, but was reported missing during transit. The courier responsible claimed no knowledge of what happened to the package after it was signed for at the department's receiving office. Internal investigation yielded no answers, and the case was eventually closed as an unsolved theft. Some secrets, it seems, resist all efforts at preservation and documentation. Perhaps that is for the best. After all, not all mysteries are meant to be solved, and not all knowledge brings comfort to those who acquire it. The hills of northern Alabama stand silent now, their secrets held close. And somewhere, in the darkness beneath the tangled roots and fallen leaves, something waits, neither fully alive nor truly dead, in tunnels that appear on no map, remembered only in nightmares and whispered warnings. If you find yourself driving the back roads of Walker County as darkness falls, and feel a strange compulsion to pull over and walk into the densely wooded hills, resist that urge. Some voices that call to us from the shadows are best left unanswered. And should you ever encounter an antique pocket watch, stopped precisely at 3:17, do not attempt to wind it. According to local legend, those who restore time's flow to these watches find themselves awakening at that exact hour each morning thereafter, with dirt beneath their fingernails and the lingering sensation of having traveled far beneath the earth's surface while their conscious minds slept. They report dreams of descending into darkness, of walls that breathe and shift, of voices that speak in their own tones, but with words they would never choose. And in the deepest part of these dreams, they find themselves in a circular chamber with a pit at its center, a pit from which emanates a sound, like countless whispering voices, all promising knowledge and power, for the simple price of allowing something ancient and patient to finally emerge into the light. The Ravensbrook incident remains one of Alabama's most disturbing unsolved mysteries, not because of what we know, but because of what has been systematically removed from the record. The fragments that remain paint a picture of corporate negligence, human suffering, and perhaps something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface of our comfortable assumptions about the natural world. As one anonymous researcher noted in an unpublished manuscript from 1988, The most terrifying aspect of the Ravensbrück case is not what was found in those tunnels, but rather what might have escaped them, moving through the darkness beneath our feet, patient and unseen, waiting for another opportunity to emerge. The manuscript was never completed. Its author checked into a mental health facility 3 weeks after beginning the project, reporting persistent nightmares and the unshakable sensation of being watched by entities that retreated just beyond his peripheral vision when he attempted to observe them directly. For now, the hills keep their counsel. The wind whispers through trees that have grown over the foundations of a town almost entirely expunged from official records, and somewhere beneath, in darkness impenetrable and ancient, something waits, neither forgotten nor forgiven, neither alive nor dead, but patient beyond human comprehension.